Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into how one single incredibly gripping emotion, fear, literally became the rock-solid foundation of Thomas Hobbes' entire political philosophy. When we think of political systems, we usually picture noble ideals, right? Justice, liberty, freedom. But for Hobbes, the ultimate building block of human society wasn't noble at all. It was raw, unfiltered terror. Picture this. It's 1588, and the massive Spanish Armada is fast approaching England. We're talking a literal fleet of warships threatening complete and total destruction. Well, this terrifying news actually sent Hobbes' mother into premature labor. It's this wild cinematic origin story that he later wrote down in his Latin autobiography, the Vita Carm Expressa, basically to explain that he and fear entered the world together. As he famously put it, fear and I were born twins. So let's look at Section 1, the state of nature. Hobbes actually took this profound, very personal sense of dread from his birth and scaled it all the way up to explain the entire human condition. I want you to imagine a world with absolutely zero laws, no police, no overarching authority, nobody to call if things go wrong. Hobbes called this the state of nature. And in this condition, your absolute greatest, most primal motivation is simply not being killed. Hobbes argued that this deep psychological fear of violent death is the true central element of human nature. It creates a state of constant, unbearable anxiety, just a relentless war of every man against every man. Moving on to Section 2, fear's surprising dual role. Now, you might be thinking an entire philosophy built solely on fear would just be hopelessly pessimistic, right? But Hobbes actually saw this highly constructive mechanism hiding right there inside our dread. On the one hand, yes, fear is incredibly destructive. It causes endless conflict, total paranoia in the state of nature. But, and here's the twist, by that exact same token, it is the creative, rational catalyst that actually forces human beings to seek peace. It perfectly balances out that overly simplistic idea that fear is only a bad thing. For Hobbes, fear is what wakes us up. It makes us rational. Let's trace how this builds logically. Our absolute terror of a violent death leads directly to a completely rational desire for self-preservation. You want to survive, right? Well, this rational desire triggers what Hobbes calls the first law of nature, which is seek peace. And logically, the only way to actually guarantee that peace is to form a social contract, where we surrender our individual, lawless power to a sovereign. We aren't signing this contract out of some kind of idealistic sense of cooperation, no way. It is a highly calculated, totally rational strategy just to escape the absolute horror of the state of nature. Which brings us to Section 3, the sovereign and the sword. So once we actually manage to escape the state of nature, what's stopping us from just breaking the rules the absolute second we feel safe? Well, Hobbes' famous maxim hits the nail on the head here. Covenants without the sword are but words. He argued that we really don't cooperate out of any inherent goodness. We surrender our power because living under the organized fear of a sovereign's punishment, that's the sword, is just far safer and way more predictable than the chaotic fear of each other. Fear is the very thing we are desperately trying to escape, but paradoxically, it's also the exact tool the sovereign uses to maintain order. Because without that looming threat of punishment, a contract achieves absolutely nothing. Let's look at Section 4, a lifetime of anticipatory fear. You see, this whole concept of anticipatory fear wasn't just some abstract political theory for Hobbes. It actively dictated his own real-world survival strategies. If we trace his life, we see a man who consistently acted on a rational dread. Back in 1640, long before the English Civil War truly erupted into all-out violence, he saw the Long Parliament moving against royalists. His rational fear immediately kicked in, and he preemptively fled to France for what turned into an 11-year exile. Later on, in 1666, after the Great Plague and the fire had absolutely ravaged England, religious zealots started hunting down supposed atheists. To avoid terrifying charges of treason, Hobbes literally burned his own manuscripts. Fear really was his lifelong companion, constantly prompting him to take rational action long before disaster actually struck. And finally, Section 5, evaluating Hobbes today. While it's incredibly tempting to look at his entire life's work purely as a trauma response to all the turbulence of the 16th and 17th centuries, we do have to be a bit careful with our analysis here. As the prominent scholar Richard Tuck warns in his very short introduction, we really need to avoid reducing Hobbes' massive philosophical system down to just a mere psychological biography. Because Hobbes actually built a highly structured, logical system. He was a huge admirer of mathematics, and he intended his philosophy to be a rigorous geometry method of deductive reasoning. So that famous burst story about the Spanish Armada, it's a fantastic hook and a brilliant metaphor for sure, but his philosophy itself is a tight, logical construction, not just a diary of his own personal phobias.
When we step back and evaluate Hobbes today, his strengths and his weaknesses become remarkably clear. His massive strength is absolutely the fact that he gave politics a very grounded psychological realism. He stripped away all those flowery rhetorical ideals and just dealt with humans exactly as they actually are. But his weakness? Well, later critics like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that basing an entire state solely on fear completely ignores positive human cooperation. It ignores community spirit, and it ignores genuine moral bonds. They strongly felt that humanity was, far more than just a collection of terrified individuals merely trying to survive.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question for you to consider about your own psychology, and frankly, our modern world as a whole. Are we truly bound together by a shared desire to cooperate and by genuine moral bonds? Or, when push comes to shove and things truly fall apart, is the fear of the sovereign sword, that threat of law, police, and punishment, is that really the only thing genuinely keeping human civilization intact? It's a highly provocative thought to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the foundations of the world around you.